Some car brands die quietly, others leave behind legends, lawsuits, or a museum exhibit. From India's forgotten ambassador to Sweden's turbocharged ghost, these are the dead car brands the world left behind, each with its own story and a final drive into history. Brand number 15. Hindustan Motors, India. India's car market today is obsessed with small, efficient, affordable machines. But once upon a time, it was ruled by a car that looked like British royalty on wheels. The Hindustan Ambassador. Introduced in 1958 and based on the British Morris Oxford Series 3, the Ambassador became India's de facto national car, used by politicians, diplomats, and taxi drivers alike. It wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of power, status, and stability in a newly independent country trying to find its feet. And for decades that worked. Between 1958 and 2014, the Ambassador was manufactured with minimal design changes, a testament to its staying power, and also its biggest weakness. Because while the rest of the world was shifting to aerodynamics, ABS brakes, and fuel injection, the Ambassador stuck with steel body panels, carburetors, and leaf spring suspensions that belonged to another era. By 2000, sales had already plunged from a peak of over 20,000 units a year in the 80s to barely 2,000 annually. The company, Hindustan Motors, based in Kolkata, failed to innovate. They missed the compact car boom, ignored the growing demand for fuel economy, and were completely blindsided by Maruti Suzuki, which offered modern hatchbacks at lower prices with better mileage and smoother rides. By the time the Ambassador's final unit rolled off the assembly line in 2014, it wasn't just outdated, it was outclassed. In a poetic twist, the rights to the Ambassador name were eventually sold to Peugeot for just 80 crore rupees, $12 million. A brand that once symbolized colonial ties, now owned by a French company. In a globalized auto market, the Ambassador simply couldn't survive. Brand number 14. Humber, UK. Not every car brand dies from failure. Some die from mergers, mismanagement, and getting stuck in the wrong war at the wrong time. That was the fate of Humber, once one of Britain's most prestigious automakers. If Rolls-Royce was the car for royalty, Humber was the ride for the empire's top brass. Generals, civil servants, and high-ranking officials all rode in Humber Super Snipes and Pullmans. Founded in the late 1800s and building its first car in 1898, Humber was an early pioneer in British motoring. By the 1930s and 40s, it had carved a name for itself, making luxurious saloons and military staff cars, with reliability and comfort that earned it contracts during both World Wars. During World War II, Humber even produced armored cars for the British Army, vehicles used across Europe, North Africa, and Southeast Asia. But after the war, the roads shifted. The British public didn't want military sedans or ministerial limos. They wanted nimble, affordable cars that matched post-war economics and consumer realities. Humber responded, slowly. By the 1950s, Humber was owned by the Roots Group, a collection of struggling British marques like Hillman and Sunbeam. Despite a few stylish attempts like the Humber Hawk and Snipe Series 4, the brand failed to innovate on fuel efficiency, cost, and performance compared to rivals like Ford UK and Vauxhall. And just as Japanese and German cars were starting to flood the European market with better value, Humber got entangled in something worse than bad sales: corporate chaos. In 1967, Chrysler Corporation acquired a controlling interest in Roots. Within a decade, Chrysler began shutting down unprofitable brands, and by 1976, Humber was completely dissolved. No fanfare, no final model, just a quiet disappearance from British streets. Today, Humber's legacy survives only in collectors' garages and military museums. An old-world brand that once moved the men who moved the map, until the map moved on without them. Brand number 13. Saab, Sweden. Some car brands are born in factories. Saab was born in an aircraft hangar. When Svenska Aeroplan AB, Sweden's wartime aircraft manufacturer, decided to build a car in 1945, they didn't just design a vehicle. They engineered a machine the way you'd engineer a plane. Aerodynamics, safety, efficiency. Long before buzzwords like wind tunnel tested or driver-centric, Saab had it in their DNA. The Saab 92, released in 1949, looked like nothing else on the road. It was curved like a drop of water, used a two-stroke engine, and was safer at high speeds than most of its contemporaries. It wasn't just quirky, it was brilliant. But Saab didn't stop at weird. They became pioneers. In the 1970s and 80s, Saab popularized turbocharging in passenger cars, making models like the Saab 99 Turbo and 900 Turbo legends in Europe and cult favorites in the US. They built cars with heated seats, headlight wipers, and active crumple zones, years ahead of most of the market. By the mid-1990s, Saab had loyalists, journalists, and safety experts all rooting for them. But underneath the innovation was a problem: money. A small, independent automaker competing against global giants couldn't keep up forever. In 2000, General Motors bought a controlling stake in Saab. And while the early promise was big, platform sharing, modernized factories, global reach, what followed was dilution. Saab started borrowing heavily from GM's parts bin. The Saab 92X was a rebranded Subaru. The 97X was basically a Chevy Trailblazer in a tuxedo. And for purists, it wasn't Saab anymore. Sales declined sharply. That year, GM pulled the plug. Dutch automaker Spyker tried to revive it. Then Chinese-backed NEVS National Electric Vehicle Sweden bought the assets in 2012. But due to trademark rights and supply issues, even they couldn't use the Saab name. By 2016, NEVS abandoned the Saab badge altogether. And just like that, a brand that once designed cars like jet engines quietly faded from the road. Today, Saab is remembered for what it stood for, more than what it sold. It didn't just make safe cars, it made drivers feel like they were behind the wheel of something different, engineered, not just manufactured. Brand number 12, Saturn USA. In the late 1980s, the American auto industry was in trouble. Japanese automakers were dominating with small, efficient, reliable cars that made the big three look like dinosaurs. So General Motors did something radical. Instead of tweaking a Chevy or rebranding an Oldsmobile, they built an entirely new company from scratch. They called it Saturn. Saturn was supposed to be different. Different from GM, different from Toyota. Even their slogan said it: a different kind of company, a different kind of car. Launched in 1985 with over $5 billion in funding, Saturn had its own factory in Tennessee, its own engineering team, even its own labor contracts. They introduced plastic body panels that didn't dent, a no-haggle pricing model, and dealerships that felt more like Apple stores than car lots. By the early 90s, it worked. The Saturn S Series became a hit. They sold over 1 million cars in their first 6 years, and customer satisfaction was among the highest in the industry. People didn't just buy Saturns, they loved them. But behind the optimism was a flaw. Saturn was still owned by GM. And as the company's internal politics shifted, Saturn was no longer the golden child. Investment slowed, innovation stalled. By the early 2000s, Saturn was rebadging Opels from Europe, straying from the original vision. Models like the Ion, Aura, and Relay felt less new wave and more corporate filler. Sales dropped. From a peak of 286,000 vehicles sold in 1994, Saturn slipped below 100,000 by 2009. Then came the financial crash. In the chaos of GM's bankruptcy and government bailout, Saturn was one of 4 brands cut. An attempted sale to Penske Automotive fell through at the last minute, and just like that, Saturn was gone. What makes Saturn unique is that it didn't die from bad cars, bad engineering, or bad intentions. It died because GM lost faith in its own best idea. Brand number 11, Pontiac USA. If Saturn was GM's quiet rebellion, Pontiac was its roar. This was the brand that gave America the GTO, widely credited as the first true muscle car. It made the Firebird, the Trans Am, and a generation of cars that didn't whisper efficiency. They screamed speed, style, and attitude. Founded in 1926 and named after a Native American chief and the Michigan city where it was based, Pontiac spent most of its early life as GM's mid-tier brand, above Chevrolet but just below Buick. It wasn't until the 1960s that Pontiac exploded into cultural relevance. Under performance-minded executives like John DeLorean, Pontiac leaned into youth marketing, horsepower wars, and road presence. By 1968, it was selling nearly 1 million cars per year. The GTO became an icon. The Trans Am starred in Smokey and the Bandit. And for a while, Pontiac wasn't just surviving, it was cooler than Chevy. But like many muscle brands, the oil crisis of the 1970s changed everything. Gas prices soared, emissions standards tightened, and Pontiac, like the rest of Detroit, was forced to adapt or shrink. In the 80s and 90s, Pontiac struggled to redefine itself. Cars like the Fiero and Grand Prix GTP showed flashes of brilliance, but they were often hampered by cost-cutting, badge engineering, and GM's internal cannibalism. By the 2000s, Pontiac was bleeding identity. The Aztek, while later praised for its practicality, was mocked for its design. The G6 and Torrent felt like rebadged rentals. Even the promising Pontiac G8, a rear-wheel drive V8 sedan based on the Australian Holden Commodore, came too late to save the brand. Then came the Great Recession. GM filed for bankruptcy in 2009. And to survive, it had to let go of the brands that weren't pulling their weight: Hummer, Saturn, Saab, and Pontiac. The final Pontiac, a 2010 G6, rolled off the line in Orion Township, Michigan. No parade, no farewell package, just silence. Pontiac didn't die because it ran out of fans. It died because GM ran out of chances. It's still one of the most mourned car brands in America, a badge that stood for speed, swagger, and the freedom of the open road. Brand number 10, NSU Germany. While Pontiac raced down American highways with V8 Thunder, across the Atlantic, Germany had a different vision: engineering minimalism with futuristic ambition. And no one embodied that more than NSU. Founded in 1873 as a knitting machine manufacturer in Neckarsulm, NSU shifted to bicycles, motorcycles, and eventually automobiles. By the 1950s, it was a major player in Europe's post-war recovery, producing nimble, fuel-efficient cars like the NSU Prince, which gained popularity in Germany for being both affordable and mechanically robust. But NSU didn't want to just build another small car. It wanted to build the future. In the 1960s, NSU bet everything on a revolutionary technology: the Wankel rotary engine, compact, lightweight, fewer moving parts than a piston engine. It promised high RPMs, smoother performance, and a dramatic reduction in engine size. Their flagship, the NSU Row 80, launched in 1967. It was years ahead of its time. Front-wheel drive, four-wheel disc brakes, aerodynamic fastback design, and a twin-rotor Wankel engine under the hood. The Row 80 even won the 1968 European Car of the Year, beating out more established rivals like BMW and Peugeot. But that engine, NSU's great leap, turned out to be its downfall. Rotary engines, while innovative, had real problems in early applications. Apex seals wore down rapidly, sometimes under 30,000 kilometers. Fuel economy was poor. Emissions were difficult to control, and repair costs were high for such an obscure powertrain. Warranty claims flooded in. Dealers couldn't keep up with repairs. By 1970, NSU was bleeding money from its warranty department faster than it could make it on sales. With debts mounting, NSU was acquired by Volkswagen in 1969 and merged into Auto Union, the group that would eventually become Audi. By 1977, NSU's name was gone from all car badges. The Row 80 was discontinued. The rotary dream ended, not with a bang, but with a slow, expensive sigh. Today, NSU survives only in name, buried inside Audi's factory walls in Neckarsulm. But its legacy lives on as a reminder that being ahead of your time can be just as dangerous as being behind. Brand number 9, Moskvitch Russia. While NSU died chasing the future, Moskvitch died clinging to the past. In the heart of Soviet Russia, Moskvitch wasn't just a car brand, it was a symbol of industrial pride, mass mobility, and national identity. Founded in the 1930s Moscow, its very name meant a person from Moscow. And its cars were meant for everyone in the USSR, the factory worker, the teacher, the soldier turned civilian. With roots in licensed Opel designs and early assistance from Ford, Moskvitch developed its first major models post-World War II. The Moskvitch 400, released in 1946, was based on the German Opel Kadett, but simplified, ruggedized, and built to withstand the Russian winter and unpaved countryside roads. Through the Cold War decades, Moskvitch churned out cars like the Moskvitch 412 and 2140, which earned a reputation for being simple to repair, nearly indestructible, and affordable to build at scale. At its peak in the late 1970s, Moskvitch produced over 200,000 cars annually, exporting to more than 60 countries, including France, Finland, and even the UK. In fact, Moskvitch had a brief cult following in parts of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe for their toughness and DIY friendliness. But as the Iron Curtain thinned, so did the brand's ability to compete. Global markets evolved. Fuel injection, airbags, power steering, safety standards, and emissions controls became the norm. And Moskvitch didn't keep up. Even in the 1990s, the company was producing models with carbureted engines, ancient suspension setups, and sheet metal prone to rust within years. When the Soviet Union collapsed, so did the subsidies that kept Moskvitch alive. The plant limped along into the early 2000s, desperately underfunded, outdated, and irrelevant, until it finally shut down in 2002. By then, Russian buyers had options: Hyundai, Renault, Lada, now reborn under new leadership. Moskvitch had become a relic. But in a surreal twist, Moskvitch was revived in 2022 by the Russian government, largely as a response to Western sanctions and the exodus of foreign automakers after the invasion of Ukraine. The new Moskvitch is mostly a rebadged Chinese JAC crossover, assembled in Moscow under state control. It carries the name, yes, but the soul, the stubborn Soviet working-class soul of Moskvitch, is gone. Today, the revival feels less like a comeback and more like an echo of a ghost, used for geopolitical optics rather than engineering revival. Brand number 8, Cisitalia, Italy. If Moskvitch was steel-forged utility, Cisitalia was automotive poetry. Born in post-war Italy in 1946, Cisitalia wasn't built for the masses. It wasn't designed to be practical, cheap, or even profitable. It was created to elevate the automobile into art. Founded by industrialist and motorsport enthusiast Piero Duccio, Cisitalia, short for Compagnia Industriale Sportiva Italia, emerged from a time when Italy was rebuilding from the ashes of World War II. But instead of focusing on recovery or affordability, Duccio went in the opposite direction: speed, design, and elegance. The company started with single-seater race cars and small displacement racers like the Cisitalia D46, which won dozens of events across Europe in the late 1940s. But its true legacy would come not from the track, but from the museum. In 1947, Cisitalia unveiled the Cisitalia 202, a vehicle so beautiful, so clean in design, that it changed the way cars were shaped. Styled by Battista Pininfarina, yes, the same Pininfarina that would later sculpt Ferraris, the 202 was revolutionary. It had no separate fenders, no visible seams, just one flowing aerodynamic shell. It looked less like a car and more like a teardrop in motion. The New York Museum of Modern Art thought so too. In 1951, the Cisitalia 202 became the first car to be added to MoMA's permanent design collection. It's still there today, but artistry doesn't always pay the bills. While the 202 was a design triumph, it was extremely expensive to build, and Cisitalia's racing program was bleeding cash. Piero Duccio tried to expand to Argentina, even launching an F1 project with the legendary Ferdinand Porsche behind the engine design. But it was too ambitious, too costly, and too disconnected from production reality. By the late 1950s, Cisitalia was struggling. Production had slowed to a crawl. The brand never truly commercialized beyond a few hundred handcrafted models. By the early 1960s, Cisitalia ceased car production completely. No bankruptcy scandal, no media coverage, just silence. It disappeared the same way it had arrived, quietly, beautifully, and completely out of sync with the market. Yet it remains one of the few car brands more revered in death than in life. A brand that proved cars could be art before the world was ready to accept it. Brand number 7, Triumph, UK. While Cisitalia chased perfection in the museum, Triumph chased freedom on the open road. Founded in 1885 as a bicycle company, Triumph didn't start building cars until the 1920s. But by the 1950s and 60s, it had carved out something distinctly British. Lightweight, stylish, affordable sports cars that gave everyday drivers a taste of elegance and adventure. The golden age of Triumph wasn't built in wind tunnels or sculpted by global design houses. It was built in pub conversations, weekend garage projects, and summer country drives. It was about the experience, not the efficiency. And Triumph delivered. From the elegant TR2 and TR3 to the iconic Spitfire and the crowd favorite TR6, these cars were simple rear-wheel drive machines that looked beautiful, handled sharply, and didn't cost Ferrari money to enjoy. In the US especially, Triumph became the affordable British sports car for college kids, young professionals, and purists who wanted a connection to the road. At its peak, Triumph was exporting over 80% of its production, especially to North America. In 1968, they sold over 80,000 units, outselling even some American domestic rivals in the roadster segment. But under the hood, the brand was starting to wobble. Triumph was merged into Leyland Motors in the 1960s, which then became British Leyland, a sprawling government-backed mega conglomerate that controlled everything from MG to Jaguar to Austin. And with that merger came chaos. Triumph's models began competing with other British Leyland brands internally, often cannibalizing sales. Quality declined. Labor strikes were rampant. Worse, while Japanese and German competitors were introducing reliable, well-built, fuel-efficient alternatives, British Leyland stuck to the past. By the late 1970s, Triumph cars were plagued with poor electrical systems, rust-prone bodies, and inconsistent build quality, often varying from car to car. The final nail came in 1984 when the last production model, the Triumph Acclaim, essentially a rebadged Honda Ballade, rolled off the line. It was the first Honda built in the UK, and the last car to wear a Triumph badge. Ironically, the motorcycles lived on. Triumph motorcycles, sold off and revived independently in the 90s, is now thriving, global, profitable, and expanding. But the car division? It exists only in fan clubs, restoration forums, and garage walls. Triumph didn't just lose to the market, it lost to itself. A victim of internal politics, inconsistent quality, and an industry that moved on while Britain's best brands stood still. Brand number 6, Peugeot Motorcycles, France. Not every brand dies with a headline. Some simply get absorbed, renamed, and quietly repurposed. And while Peugeot motorcycles still exist today, the brand that once symbolized French independence and urban flair is long gone. Born in 1898, Peugeot Motorcycles is one of the oldest motorcycle manufacturers in the world. They debuted their first petrol-powered two-wheeler before the Wright brothers even flew. And by the early 20th century, Peugeot bikes were racing in Grand Prix circuits, delivering telegrams and zipping across cobblestone streets with unmistakable Parisian confidence. In the decades that followed, they became a staple of French daily life. Through the post-war era and into the 70s and 80s, Peugeot scooters like the SX5, 103 moped, and Ludix were known for being reliable in traffic, lightweight and efficient, and more affordable than larger Italian rivals. Their peak came in the late 20th century, when Peugeot held one of the largest shares in Europe's small motorcycle segment, especially in France, Italy, and parts of North Africa. But then, the world got faster, and Peugeot didn't. The 2000s brought in a wave of Japanese and Taiwanese competitors. Kymco, Siem, Honda, and Yamaha began flooding the market with sleeker, better-engineered scooters. Meanwhile, Peugeot's offerings stagnated. Their designs became dated, innovation slowed, and emission regulations in Europe tightened, forcing older two-stroke models off the road. By 2015, it was clear Peugeot motorcycles couldn't compete alone. That year, Indian auto giant Mahindra & Mahindra stepped in, acquiring a 51% controlling stake and later full ownership by 2019. What followed was a rebranding of Seoul. Production shifted to India. New models like the Peugeot Django and Metropolis three-wheeler were marketed under French nostalgia, but designed for global utility. And while Mahindra promised to protect the brand's DNA, it also had its own goals: scale, manufacturing leverage, market penetration. Peugeot's two-wheel division lost its autonomy. The lion logo remained, yes, but the Parisian spirit behind it? Gone. It's a living company now, in name only. An historic badge on a global spreadsheet. And in many ways, that's a quieter kind of death. Not one of bankruptcy or scandal, but a slow surrender of identity in exchange for survival. Brand number 5, Mercury USA. Some car brands crash. Mercury was slowly suffocated. Launched by Edsel Ford in 1938, Mercury was envisioned as a bridge brand, offering more luxury than a Ford, but without the price tag of a Lincoln. And for a while, it worked beautifully. By the 1950s, Mercury was crafting stylish cruisers like the Monterey, which blended American flair with understated elegance. It was a favorite for middle-class families who wanted something more than a Ford Fairlane but didn't need to go full Cadillac. Throughout the 60s and 70s, Mercury became a badge of subtle power. The Cougar, Mercury's pony car rival to the Mustang, was a sleeper hit, winning Motor Trend's Car of the Year in 1967. Models like the Marquis, Montego, and Capri helped Mercury crack over 580,000 units sold in 1978, ranking among the top 10 brands in the US. But as the decades turned, Mercury began losing its edge. It wasn't just competing with GM and Chrysler, it was competing with Ford itself. By the 1980s and 1990s, Mercury had become heavily reliant on badge engineering. The Mercury Sable was just a restyled Ford Taurus. The Tracer was a rebadged Mazda. The Villager minivan was basically a Nissan Quest. None of this was inherently bad. Some were even well-reviewed. But they lacked identity. Mercury was no longer building a case for its existence. It was just an alternate trim level. Internally, Mercury became a brand Ford didn't know what to do with. Its buyers skewed older, its lineup was shrinking, and every time a model was redesigned, the question wasn't, how can we make Mercury stand out? It was, how do we make this look different enough from the Ford version? Sales reflected the confusion. From nearly 500,000 cars in 2000, Mercury dropped to just over 90,000 by 2010, a number Ford couldn't justify. And so, in June 2010, Ford officially announced the end of Mercury after 72 years. There was no major marketing send-off, no collector's edition Cougar, just a quiet halt in production and a footnote in annual reports. And yet, the death of Mercury signaled something bigger, the end of mid-tier American brands. In an age of hyper-segmentation, where buyers want either budget value or full-blown luxury, Mercury's in-between niche simply vanished. Today, Mercury is remembered with a kind of quiet affection. Not for its innovation, but for the way it once made average feel just a little above average. Brand number 4, Tucker USA. If Mercury disappeared because it blended in, Tucker was destroyed because it stood out too far, too fast. In 1948, America was riding a post-war high. Factories were booming, optimism was currency, and cars were back in demand. But while the big three were slowly retooling their pre-war platforms, one man tried to rewrite the rules overnight. His name was Preston Tucker, a former police officer, engineer, and visionary. His car? The Tucker 48. Often called the Tucker Torpedo, a prototype so advanced, it made everything else on the road look like a relic. It had a rear-mounted helicopter-derived flat-six engine, fuel injection, a center-mounted third headlight that turned with the steering wheel, four-wheel independent suspension, a fully sealed steel safety frame and padded dashboard, and a pop-out windshield designed to eject during a crash, reducing injury. In 1948, that's more than 70 years ahead of some safety features we now consider standard. Tucker wasn't just building a car, he was building an entirely new automotive philosophy, one where safety, innovation, and performance coexisted from day one. The public was hooked. Tucker raised $17 million from investors and over $2 million through dealership licenses. The factory in Chicago was running, the cars were real, and the demand was overwhelming. But the big three weren't interested in competition, nor was the government. Within months of launching, Tucker was hit with a highly publicized SEC investigation, one that accused him of fraud, even though no financial misconduct was ever proven. The media turned, investors fled, the factory was shuttered. Only 51 Tucker 48s were ever built. Production was halted before full-scale manufacturing even began. In 1950, after years of legal battles, Preston Tucker was acquitted of all charges. But the company was already dead. Historians still debate what really killed Tucker. Was it an ambitious dreamer out of his depth? Or was it a coordinated takedown from Detroit's corporate elite? Either way, Tucker remains one of the most iconic, what-could-have-been stories in automotive history, a case study in how innovation doesn't always win, especially when it threatens the establishment. Today, the surviving Tucker cars are collector gold. Each is worth over $2 million, and one of them sits in the Henry Ford Museum, poetically parked under the spotlight of the very empire that may have helped kill it. Brand number 3, Oldsmobile USA. If Tucker was taken out for being too bold, Oldsmobile died from being too familiar. Founded in 1897 by Ransom E. Olds, Oldsmobile was older than Ford, older than Cadillac. In fact, it was the first American car brand to mass-produce automobiles, thanks to the 1901 Curved Dash, a horseless carriage that changed how Americans moved. By the 1950s and 60s, Oldsmobile wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. This was a brand that introduced the rocket V8 engine, one of the most powerful and reliable motors of its time. It was the first to put a fully automatic transmission, the Hydra-Matic, into a production car. Models like the 88, the 98, and later the Cutlass weren't just popular, they were defining icons of middle-class aspiration. By 1977, Oldsmobile was selling over 1 million cars a year, making it one of the best-selling brands in America. For comparison, that's more than BMW, Mercedes, and Lexus combined today. So what happened? It started with success. As Oldsmobile grew, so did its dependence on the GM parts bin. Badge engineering quietly crept in. The 1980s saw Oldsmobiles that were barely distinguishable from their Buick or Pontiac siblings, but the tipping point came in the 1990s. General Motors tried to reinvent Oldsmobile for a younger generation. Out went the chrome and heritage, in came rounded edges, futuristic names, and edgy ads. The Aurora was sleek, the Intrigue was sporty, but they no longer looked or felt like an Oldsmobile. Worse, the once dedicated Oldsmobile buyer, loyal, older, middle income, didn't recognize the brand anymore. And the younger buyers GM was chasing, they didn't care. Sales plummeted. From 1 million cars a year in the 70s, Oldsmobile dropped below 300,000 by the early 2000s. In 2000, GM made it official. Oldsmobile would be phased out. The last model to roll off the line? A 2004 Alero signed by every employee at the Lansing, Michigan plant. A ceremonial full stop on 107 years of automotive history. Oldsmobile didn't die because it failed. It died because it lost itself. It tried to be everything and ended up being nothing unique. Lancia, Italy. If Oldsmobile faded because it lost its identity, Lancia died clinging too tightly to its own past. Founded in 1906 in Turin by Vincenzo Lancia, a former Fiat test driver, the brand was always a step ahead. Lancia gave the world the first production car with a complete electrical system, the first V6 engine, and even a monocoque chassis back in 1922. They didn't just build cars, they engineered ideas. But where Lancia truly cemented its legend was on the rally stage. From the Stratos to the Delta Integral, they didn't just race, they dominated. Between 1974 and 1992, Lancia racked up 10 World Rally Championships, a record that still stands. Their cars weren't just fast, they were works of art. Aggressive, angular, authentically Italian. But here's where the cracks began. In the 1990s, Lancia's parent company Fiat began cost-cutting. Gone were the bespoke platforms and in-house innovation. Instead, Lancias became rebadged Fiats with more chrome and softer suspension. The Thesis, Libra, and Ypsilon looked confused. They weren't performance machines anymore, and they weren't luxurious enough to compete with BMW or Mercedes either. By the early 2000s, Lancia's identity was in crisis. No new rally cars, no new innovation, just sedans nobody outside of Italy wanted to buy. But the real blow came in 2011, when Fiat tried to revive Lancia by selling rebadged Chryslers under the Lancia name in Europe. The result? A Lancia-badged Chrysler 300 called the Lancia Thema. A car so out of sync with Lancia's brand DNA, it confused even loyalists. Sales dropped to embarrassing lows. In 2013, Lancia sold just 85,000 cars globally, 97% of them in Italy. By 2015, the company announced it would pull out of every market except Italy and would sell only one model, the Ypsilon. A once great name reduced to a city car. Today, Lancia technically still exists, but it's a ghost. A one-model brand confined to a single country. Once the pride of Turin, now a footnote on Stellantis' balance sheet. Brand number 1, DeLorean, USA. John DeLorean was once Detroit royalty. He gave the world the Pontiac GTO, the Firebird, and helped shape muscle car culture. But when he left GM to start his own company in 1975, his goal wasn't just to build a car, it was to change the entire automotive industry. Enter the DeLorean DMC-12. Designed by Giorgetto Giugiaro, clad in unpainted brushed stainless steel, and built in Northern Ireland with funding from both the British government and private investors, this car looked like it rolled off a spaceship. But beneath the stainless steel was a long list of problems. The engine, a sluggish Peugeot Renault Volvo V6, produced only 130 horsepower, making the DMC-12 all-style, no speed. Its gull-wing doors looked cool, until they got stuck. The fiberglass underbody warped. The quality control was so bad that nearly every DMC had to be reworked before being sold. By 1982, the company was out of money. Then came the scandal. John DeLorean was arrested in an FBI drug sting operation, allegedly trying to traffic $24 million worth of cocaine to save his company. Although he was acquitted, the damage was done. Only about 9,000 DMC-12s were ever built. But ironically, it was Hollywood, not Detroit, that gave it immortality. In 1985, the car became the time machine in Back to the Future. And just like that, a failed car became a cultural icon. But let's not forget, behind the movie, Magic was a company that collapsed under the weight of ambition, inexperience, and poor execution. DeLorean didn't just run out of money, it ran out of time. Some brands fade, others explode, but every dead car tells a story worth remembering. Hit subscribe if you want more forgotten legends and the truth behind their final drive.